For generations, fish has been promoted as one of the healthiest protein sources available, particularly for older adults seeking to maintain cognitive function and cardiovascular health. Medical professionals routinely recommend incorporating fish into weekly meal plans, citing the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids and lean protein. What many seniors don't realize, however, is that not all fish are created equal. Behind the seemingly healthy choice of adding fish to your dinner plate lies a troubling reality about contamination, industrial farming practices, and the accumulation of toxins that can seriously compromise health rather than enhance it. The fish industry has undergone dramatic changes over recent decades. What was once a relatively straightforward matter of catching wild fish from clean waters has transformed into a complex global network of industrial fish farms, international shipping routes, and questionable environmental practices. As demand for affordable fish has increased, so too have the shortcuts taken in production. Many of the most popular fish species consumed by seniors today carry hidden dangers that accumulate silently in the body over time, potentially causing irreversible damage to vital organs and systems. Older adults face particular vulnerability when it comes to toxin exposure from contaminated fish. The aging body processes and eliminates toxins less efficiently than younger systems. Kidneys and liver function naturally decline with age, meaning that heavy metals and other pollutants remain in the body longer, building up in tissues and organs. The blood-brain barrier, which protects the brain from harmful substances, can become more permeable with age, allowing neurotoxins easier access to delicate brain tissue. And these physiological changes mean that the same portion of contaminated fish that might cause minimal harm to a younger person could have serious consequences for someone in their 60s, 70s, or beyond. Farmed salmon has become one of the most commonly consumed fish in America, appearing on restaurant menus and grocery store shelves at prices far lower than wild-caught varieties. The affordability and year-round availability make it an attractive option for seniors on fixed incomes. So yet this convenience comes at a significant cost to health. Industrial salmon farming operations crowd thousands of fish into confined net pens in coastal waters, creating conditions ripe for disease, parasites, and the need for chemical interventions that would never occur in nature. The fish packed into these underwater feedlots live in their own waste, creating an environment where pathogens thrive. To combat the inevitable infections that spread through densely populated pens, farmers routinely administer antibiotics. These antibiotics don't simply disappear once the fish are harvested. They remain in the flesh that consumers eat, introducing antibiotic residues into the human body with every meal. For seniors, many of whom already take multiple medications daily, this additional chemical burden can interact with prescription drugs in unpredictable ways. More concerning is the contribution to antibiotic resistance, a growing public health crisis that makes treating bacterial infections increasingly difficult. The diet fed to farmed salmon presents another serious problem. Wild salmon consume a natural diet of krill, small fish, and other marine organisms rich in the omega-3 fatty acids that make salmon nutritionally valuable. Farmed salmon, by contrast, eat manufactured pellets containing fish meal, fish oil, and increasingly plant-based ingredients like soy and corn. To achieve the pink flesh color consumers expect, synthetic astaxanthin is added to feed, since farmed salmon would otherwise have gray flesh from their unnatural diet. These pellets often contain contaminants concentrated from the smaller fish ground up to make them, including PCBs, dioxins, and various pesticides. Research has documented that farmed salmon can contain 10 times more toxic pollutants than wild salmon. These persistent organic pollutants accumulate in fatty tissue, and because farmed salmon tend to have higher fat content than their wild counterparts due to lack of exercise and calorie-dense feed, they store even more of these harmful chemicals. When seniors consume farmed salmon believing they're making a heart-healthy choice, they're actually ingesting a cocktail of industrial contaminants that can damage the very organs they're trying to protect. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, and deserve particular attention due to their prevalence in farmed salmon and their devastating health effects. Although banned in the United States since 1979, these chemicals persist in the environment for decades. They accumulate in sediments, enter the food chain through small organisms, and concentrate as they move up through larger fish. PCBs are classified as probable human carcinogens and have been linked to immune system suppression, reproductive problems, and neurological damage. For older adults whose immune systems are already naturally weaker, additional immune suppression from PCB exposure can increase vulnerability to infections and diseases. The neurological effects of PCBs are especially troubling for aging brains already facing increased risks of cognitive decline. Studies have shown that PCB exposure can affect memory, learning, and overall cognitive function. These effects may be subtle at first, easily dismissed as normal age-related changes, but they represent genuine damage that accumulates with repeated exposure. An older adult eating farmed salmon twice a week, thinking they're protecting their brain health with omega-3s, may actually be accelerating cognitive decline through PCB exposure. Dioxins, another group of toxic compounds found in elevated levels in farmed salmon, present similar dangers. These chemicals form as byproducts of industrial processes and, like PCBs, persist in the environment and accumulate in fatty tissues. Dioxins are known to disrupt hormone systems, damage immune function, and increase cancer risk. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies the most toxic dioxin as a known human carcinogen. For seniors concerned about cancer prevention, the irony of consuming what they believe to be a healthy food that actually increases cancer risk cannot be overstated. And the conditions in fish farms also promote the growth of sea lice, tiny parasites that attach to salmon and feed on their skin, blood, and mucus. Severe infestations can kill farmed salmon, so farmers treat the water with pesticides designed to kill the lice. These pesticides, including compounds like imamectin benzoate, remain in the fish flesh and transfer to consumers. The long-term effects of regular pesticide consumption, even in small amounts, remain incompletely understood. But research increasingly links chronic low-level pesticide exposure to Parkinson's disease, a devastating neurological condition that disproportionately affects older adults. Environmental concerns surrounding salmon farms extend beyond the fish themselves to impact wild salmon populations and marine ecosystems. When farmed salmon escape their pens, as happens regularly, they compete with wild salmon for food and spawning grounds. They spread diseases and parasites to wild populations. The concentrated waste from thousands of fish confined in a small area creates dead zones on the ocean floor beneath farms, where nothing can survive due to lack of oxygen. These environmental damages ultimately circle back to affect food safety as contamination spreads through interconnected marine systems. Imported tilapia represents another popular choice among seniors seeking affordable, mild-tasting fish. Tilapia's neutral flavor and low price point have made it a staple in restaurants and home kitchens across the country. The majority of tilapia consumed in the United States comes from overseas, primarily from China, where aquaculture practices operate under far less stringent regulations than domestic operations. The conditions under which these fish are raised would shock most consumers if they could see behind the scenes. And Chinese tilapia farms have been documented raising fish in crowded ponds contaminated with animal waste. Some operations feed tilapia feces from pigs, ducks, or chickens to reduce feed costs. While this practice might have historical precedent in small-scale traditional farming, industrial application of these methods creates serious contamination risks. Fish raised in such conditions require heavy antibiotic use to prevent disease outbreaks. China has been repeatedly cited for using antibiotics banned in the United States, including compounds that have been shown to cause cancer or other serious health problems. The antibiotic situation in imported tilapia farming deserves serious scrutiny. Chinese aquaculture operations have been found using drugs like chloramphenicol, fluoroquinolones, and malachite green, all prohibited for use in food animals in the United States due to health risks. Chloramphenicol can cause aplastic anemia, a potentially fatal blood disorder. Fluoroquinolones contribute to antibiotic resistance and may cause tendon damage, particularly problematic for older adults already at risk for falls and fractures. Malachite green is a known carcinogen with no safe level of consumption. Imported tilapia has also tested positive for heavy metal contamination, including lead, cadmium, and mercury. While tilapia generally contains less mercury than larger predatory fish, the presence of other heavy metals creates a different set of concerns. Lead exposure damages the nervous system, can cause or worsen cognitive impairment, increases blood pressure, and damages kidneys. Older adults who already face age-related kidney function decline are particularly vulnerable to lead toxicity. Cadmium accumulates primarily in kidneys and liver, causing progressive organ damage that may not become apparent until substantial harm has occurred. The nutritional profile of farm tilapia also falls short compared to other fish options. While marketed as a healthy protein source, tilapia contains very low levels of beneficial omega-3 fatty acids and relatively high levels of omega-6 fatty acids. The standard American diet already contains excessive omega-6 relative to omega-3, contributing to chronic inflammation throughout the body. Inflammation plays a central role in virtually every age-related disease, from arthritis to Alzheimer's disease to heart disease. Adding more omega-6 rich fish to the diet can actually worsen this inflammatory imbalance rather than providing the anti-inflammatory benefits associated with truly healthy fish. For seniors dealing with chronic pain, joint problems, or inflammatory conditions, the inflammatory potential of farm-raised tilapia directly contradicts the health benefits they're seeking, and they might actually experience worse symptoms while believing they're making dietary choices to improve their condition. This disconnect between perceived and actual health benefits represents one of the cruelest ironies in modern food marketing. Large tuna species, particularly bluefin, big eye, and albacore, present a different but equally serious risk profile focused primarily on mercury contamination. Mercury pollution from coal-burning power plants, mining operations, and industrial processes has contaminated oceans worldwide. This toxic heavy metal enters the marine food chain when consumed by small organisms, then concentrates as larger fish eat smaller ones. Tuna, as large, long-lived predatory fish near the top of the food chain, accumulate particularly high mercury levels in their flesh. Mercury's effects on the human body are well documented and deeply concerning, especially for older adults. This heavy metal is a potent neurotoxin that crosses the blood-brain barrier and accumulates in brain tissue. Mercury exposure damages neurons, interferes with neurotransmitter function, and can cause widespread neurological problems. Symptoms of chronic mercury exposure include memory problems, difficulty concentrating, tremors, mood changes, and numbness or tingling in extremities. For seniors already navigating the challenges of aging, yes, these symptoms might be mistakenly attributed to normal age-related changes rather than recognized as signs of toxic exposure. The cardiovascular system, which many seniors aim to protect by eating fish, can also suffer damage from mercury exposure. Research has shown that mercury counteracts many of the heart protective benefits of omega-3 fatty acids found in fish. Studies have found associations between mercury exposure and increased risk of heart attack, with some research suggesting that the mercury in fish may actually negate the cardiovascular benefits that make fish consumption desirable in the first place. This creates a troubling situation where seniors eating tuna for heart health may be causing more harm than good. Mercury's impact on blood pressure deserves particular attention for older adults, many of whom already struggle with hypertension. Mercury exposure has been linked to elevated blood pressure, arterial stiffness, and damage to blood vessel walls. These effects compound existing cardiovascular risk factors common in aging populations. An older adult carefully managing blood pressure through medication and lifestyle changes might find their efforts undermined by regular consumption of mercury-contaminated tuna. The kidneys, responsible for filtering toxins from the blood, face direct assault from mercury exposure. Mercury accumulates in kidney tissue and can cause progressive damage to the delicate filtering structures. Since kidney function naturally declines with age, older adults start from a position of reduced capacity. Adding mercury exposure to already stressed kidneys can accelerate decline toward chronic kidney disease, a serious condition affecting millions of seniors that often progresses silently until substantial damage has occurred. Tuna consumption recommendations from health authorities reflect the serious nature of mercury contamination. Pregnant women and young children receive the strongest warnings to limit or avoid tuna altogether due to mercury's devastating effects on developing nervous systems. However, the aging brain may be nearly as vulnerable as the developing brain, yet seniors rarely receive equivalent warnings. The assumption seems to be that adults can handle mercury exposure, but this assumption fails to account for the reduced resilience and impaired detoxification capacity of aging bodies. The form in which tuna is consumed matters for mercury exposure. Canned tuna, a pantry staple in many senior households due to its convenience and long shelf life, varies considerably in mercury content depending on the species. Albacore, or white tuna, contains roughly 3 times more mercury than light tuna made from smaller skipjack species. Many seniors, unaware of this distinction, choose albacore for its milder flavor and more appealing appearance, unknowingly selecting the more contaminated option. A senior eating albacore tuna sandwiches several times a week could easily exceed safe mercury exposure limits, particularly given that mercury also comes from other dietary sources and environmental exposures. Tuna steaks at restaurants present an even greater mercury risk because they typically come from larger tuna species like bluefin, big eye, or yellowfin, which accumulate more mercury than the smaller fish used in most canned products. A single restaurant portion of tuna steak can contain mercury levels that exceed recommended weekly limits. For seniors who enjoy dining out and consider tuna a healthy menu choice, ignorance of these contamination levels can lead to repeated exposure that builds up in tissues over months and years, causing damage that emerges slowly and insidiously. So the interaction between mercury and selenium, both present in fish, adds another layer of complexity to the contamination picture. Selenium appears to offer some protective effect against mercury toxicity, possibly by binding with mercury and reducing its bioavailability. Fish with high selenium relative to mercury may therefore pose less risk than their mercury content alone would suggest. However, large tuna species tend to have mercury levels that exceed their selenium content, meaning this protective effect provides insufficient defense. Seniors cannot rely on selenium to neutralize the mercury they consume through regular tuna consumption. The frequency of tuna consumption matters tremendously for older adults attempting to minimize mercury exposure while maintaining a healthy diet. Health authorities typically recommend that seniors limit their intake of high-mercury fish, such as albacore tuna, to just 1 serving per week, while light tuna might be consumed slightly more often due to its lower mercury concentration. Yet many older adults, drawn by convenience and familiarity, consume tuna multiple times weekly without realizing they accumulate mercury faster than their bodies can eliminate it. The half-life of methylmercury in human tissues spans approximately 2 months, meaning that regular consumption prevents the body from ever clearing its mercury burden. This creates a situation where mercury levels steadily climb rather than plateau, particularly concerning for seniors whose metabolic systems operate less efficiently than in younger years. The cognitive symptoms of chronic low-level mercury exposure often mirror normal age-related decline, making detection exceptionally difficult without specific testing. Memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, slower processing speed, and subtle personality changes might all be attributed to ordinary aging when they actually reflect neurotoxic damage. This diagnostic confusion means countless seniors suffer preventable neurological harm, while neither they nor their physicians connect these symptoms to dietary mercury exposure. The insidious nature of this poisoning lies precisely in its gradual onset and non-specific symptoms. Unlike acute mercury poisoning, which produces obvious dramatic effects, chronic low-level exposure slowly erodes function across years, causing damage that becomes apparent only after substantial harm has occurred. Beyond mercury, large predatory fish also concentrate other persistent organic pollutants that pose particular risks to aging bodies. Polychlorinated biphenyls, though banned decades ago, persist in ocean sediments and bioaccumulate through food chains. These industrial chemicals disrupt endocrine function, interfere with immune response, and may contribute to cognitive decline. Studies examining the body burden of these chemicals in older adults have found correlations between consumption of contaminated fish and higher PCB concentrations, with corresponding increases in inflammatory markers and oxidative stress. The cardiovascular system, already challenged by age-related changes, faces additional strain from these toxins which affect lipid metabolism and promote arterial stiffness. Farmed salmon presents a different but equally troubling set of concerns for older consumers seeking healthy protein sources. While wild salmon ranks among the most nutritious fish available, delivering abundant omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, and high-quality protein with minimal contaminants, farmed salmon often disappoints on all these measures. And the farming process itself creates conditions that necessitate chemical interventions and result in nutritionally inferior fish bearing problematic residues. Understanding the differences between wild and farmed salmon becomes essential for seniors hoping to gain benefits rather than risks from their seafood choices. Conventional salmon farming relies on densely packed net pens anchored in coastal waters, where hundreds of thousands of fish crowd together in conditions utterly unlike their natural environment. This intensive confinement creates multiple problems that farmers attempt to manage through pharmaceutical interventions. Disease spreads rapidly through such populations, prompting routine use of antibiotics to prevent epidemics that would devastate entire harvests. The enclosed pens also attract parasites, particularly sea lice that attach to fish and feed on their skin and blood. Farmers combat these parasites with pesticides and other chemicals that leave residues in fish flesh. The diet fed to farmed salmon fundamentally alters their nutritional composition compared to wild fish. Wild salmon eat smaller fish, shrimp, and krill, building up astaxanthin, a powerful antioxidant that gives their flesh its characteristic deep red color while providing significant health benefits. Farmed salmon eat manufactured pellets containing rendered proteins, plant matter, and fish meal from industrial fishing operations. This artificial diet produces naturally gray flesh that farmers must color using synthetic pigments to make the fish marketable. The feed also changes the fatty acid profile, reducing beneficial omega-3 concentrations while increasing omega-6 fats and saturated fats in ratios far different from wild salmon. Testing repeatedly shows farmed salmon contain significantly higher levels of PCBs, dioxins, and other persistent organic pollutants compared to wild salmon. These contaminants concentrate in the fatty tissues of fish, and since farmed salmon have higher overall fat content than wild salmon, they accumulate more toxins. The feed itself represents a major contamination source, as it often contains fish meal and fish oil derived from industrial catches that may include contaminated smaller fish. These toxins become concentrated as they move up through the farming process, ultimately landing on dinner plates. For seniors, the trade-offs become particularly stark. While any salmon provides protein and some omega-3 content, farmed salmon delivers these benefits alongside contaminants that may negate or reverse those advantages. The inflammatory effects of persistent pollutants counteract the anti-inflammatory benefits of omega-3s. The endocrine disruption caused by dioxin-like compounds interferes with metabolic health. The cardiovascular benefits sought through fish consumption become questionable when the fish carries a payload of chemicals that harm the very systems it should protect. A geographic origin matters considerably when evaluating farmed salmon risk. European regulations generally impose stricter limits on contaminants and farming practices compared to some other regions. Chilean farmed salmon, which dominates much of the global market, has faced particular scrutiny regarding antibiotic use and environmental practices. Asian aquaculture operations vary tremendously in their standards and oversight. Without clear labeling indicating origin and farming methods, consumers struggle to make informed choices. Many grocery stores and restaurants offer no information beyond whether salmon is wild or farmed, leaving seniors to guess about the actual risk profile of the fish they purchase. The economic incentives driving farmed salmon production work against quality and safety. Farmers maximize profitability by achieving rapid growth in minimal space using the cheapest possible feed. And these pressures encourage shortcuts and minimal chemical use only when regulations strictly enforce limits. In regions with lax oversight, conditions may deteriorate substantially below acceptable standards. Even in well-regulated areas, the fundamental model of intensive aquaculture creates inherent problems that interventions merely manage rather than solve. Color represents one easily observable indicator of salmon origin that seniors can use when shopping. Wild salmon displays deep, richly varied red to orange hues depending on species and season. Farmed salmon shows more uniform, often slightly duller coloring from synthetic pigments. The texture differs as well, with wild salmon having firmer flesh that separates into distinct flakes when cooked, while farmed salmon tends towards softer, more homogeneous texture with visible white fat stripes. Though these characteristics provide helpful clues, intentional mislabeling occurs frequently enough that visual inspection alone cannot guarantee wild origin. DNA testing and investigations by consumer advocacy groups have exposed widespread mislabeling of salmon and other seafood. Restaurants particularly show high rates of substitution, selling farmed salmon as wild to command premium prices while paying wholesale costs. Grocery stores engage in similar fraud, though perhaps less frequently. Seniors relying on claimed wild status when making purchasing decisions may actually consume farmed fish a substantial percentage of the time, unknowingly accepting exposure to contaminants they specifically tried to avoid. Price provides another rough guide, though not an absolute guarantee. Wild salmon cost significantly more than farm salmon due to limited supply, higher harvesting costs, and shorter seasonal availability. Suspiciously cheap fish labeled as wild should raise immediate skepticism. However, some purveyors do charge wild salmon prices for farmed fish, banking on consumer confusion and limited ability to verify authenticity. Building relationships with trusted fishmongers who can document their supply chains offers the most reliable path to consistently obtaining genuine wild salmon. For seniors on fixed incomes, the price premium for wild salmon may seem prohibitive, particularly when recommendations call for 2 or more fish servings weekly. This economic pressure tempts many toward farmed alternatives despite awareness of quality differences. However, other fish species offer excellent nutrition at lower cost without the contaminant burden of farmed salmon. Canned wild salmon, particularly pink or sockeye varieties, provides genuinely wild fish at a fraction of fresh prices. The canning process preserves omega-3 content while shelf stability eliminates waste from spoilage. The soft bones in canned salmon become edible after processing, delivering a substantial calcium bonus particularly valuable for seniors concerned about bone density. Smaller wild fish like sardines, mackerel, and herring deliver exceptional nutrition with minimal contamination risk. These species occupy lower positions on the food chain, eating plankton and small organisms rather than other fish. This dietary pattern prevents bioaccumulation of mercury and persistent pollutants that plague larger predators. Their size ensures they live shorter lives before harvest, providing less time to accumulate whatever contaminants exist in their environment. Their affordability makes them accessible to seniors on restricted budgets. Their convenience as canned products requiring no preparation removes barriers for older adults with limited energy or cooking ability. Yet cultural preferences and unfamiliarity create resistance to these options among many older Americans. Sardines and herring carry associations with poverty foods or wartime rations rather than health-promoting choices. Their strong flavors and visible bones deter seniors accustomed to mild, filleted fish requiring minimal confrontation with actual fish anatomy. Marketing has successfully positioned salmon, tuna, and white-fleshed fish as desirable while relegating equally nutritious options to fringe status. Overcoming these biases requires education about both the nutritional superiority and safety profiles of these underutilized species. Mediterranean and Nordic dietary patterns, recognized for promoting longevity and healthy aging, incorporate these smaller fish extensively. Populations consuming them regularly show lower rates of cardiovascular disease, better cognitive function, and reduced inflammation compared to those favoring larger fish or minimal seafood intake. The combination of abundant omega-3s, vitamin D, B vitamins, selenium, and other micronutrients in these fish supports multiple physiological systems simultaneously. Their lack of concerning contaminants means seniors gain these benefits without offsetting risks. Imported tilapia represents another commonly consumed fish that carries hidden problems particularly relevant to older adults. This mild-flavored, affordable fish appears in countless grocery stores, restaurants, and institutional food services. Its neutral taste appeals to those who dislike stronger seafood flavors. Its low cost fits tight budgets. Its year-round availability provides consistent supply. Yet the conditions under which most tilapia reaches American consumers raise serious questions about safety and nutritional value. The vast majority of tilapia consumed in the United States comes from Asian aquaculture operations, particularly China, which dominates global production. These farms raise tilapia in ponds or tanks using intensive methods that prioritize volume and efficiency over fish welfare or consumer safety. The crowded conditions breed disease, prompting antibiotic use to maintain production. Feed quality varies tremendously, with some operations using animal waste, sewage, or other questionable inputs to minimize costs. Water quality in growing facilities often fails to meet basic standards, exposing fish to environmental contaminants and pathogens. Testing of imported tilapia has revealed residues of antibiotics banned for use in food animals in the United States, including some with documented human health risks. Inspections catch only a tiny fraction of shipments, allowing contaminated products to reach consumers regularly. The chemicals used include drugs that can trigger allergic reactions, contribute to antibiotic resistance, or cause direct toxicity with repeated exposure. For seniors taking multiple medications, the addition of unknown antibiotic residues in their food creates potential for drug interactions and unpredictable effects. Beyond antibiotic residues, imported tilapia sometimes contains heavy metals and industrial pollutants absorbed from contaminated water in growing facilities. Investigations have documented unsafe levels of various toxins in products from certain suppliers and regions. The lack of consistent oversight and minimal inspection rates mean contaminated batches regularly enter commerce. Even tilapia meeting minimal safety standards often carries a background level of pollutants reflecting the poor environmental conditions in intensive aquaculture regions. The nutritional profile of tilapia raises concerns independent of contamination issues. Unlike salmon and other fatty fish rich in omega-3 fatty acids, tilapia provides minimal amounts of these beneficial fats. The feed used in farming produces flesh with elevated omega-6 fatty acids relative to omega-3s, creating a ratio that may actually promote inflammation rather than reducing it. For seniors seeking anti-inflammatory benefits from fish consumption, tilapia fails to deliver and might worsen inflammatory status, particularly when consumed frequently. The fatty acid imbalance in farmed tilapia led some researchers to question whether eating this fish provides any advantage over other protein sources and whether it might actually harm cardiovascular health. While subsequent analyses suggested the concerns were overstated and that tilapia doesn't actively damage health, the consensus clearly indicates it offers minimal benefits compared to truly nutritious fish species. Seniors choosing tilapia for health reasons would achieve better outcomes, selecting chicken, turkey, or plant proteins rather than consuming fish that lacks the beneficial components that justify seafood recommendations. Sustainability represents another dimension where tilapia farming demonstrates troubling patterns. The intensive operations that produce most imported tilapia generate enormous quantities of waste that pollute surrounding waters. Escaped fish establish invasive populations in native ecosystems where they outcompete indigenous species. The feed requirements create pressure on wild fish stocks used to produce fish meal. There, the antibiotics and chemicals used in production escape into waterways where they affect wild fish and contribute to antibiotic resistance in environmental bacteria. For seniors concerned not just with personal health, but also with environmental legacy and sustainable food systems, imported tilapia fails on multiple counts. Better options exist that provide superior nutrition without the environmental destruction and questionable safety profiles associated with industrial tilapia farming. Shifting purchasing toward these alternatives sends market signals that may gradually influence production practices, though individual consumer choices alone cannot reform deeply entrenched agricultural systems. Cod and other white-fleshed fish offer mild flavor and lean protein that appeal to many older adults, but here too, sourcing and species matter tremendously. Atlantic cod populations collapsed decades ago from overfishing and have never recovered despite strict management efforts. Most cod currently sold comes from Pacific waters or represents related species marketed under the cod name. The generic term hides important distinctions that affect both sustainability and contamination risk. Pacific cod from well-managed Alaskan fisheries represents one of the most sustainable seafood choices available. These populations remain healthy under science-based harvest limits. The fish contain minimal mercury and other contaminants due to their moderate size and dietary habits. They provide excellent lean protein, B vitamins, and minerals with virtually no contamination concerns. For seniors seeking clean protein sources, Alaskan cod earns top marks. However, cod from other Pacific regions or those caught using destructive fishing methods carry greater sustainability concerns and potentially higher contaminant levels depending on their origins. And the seafood industry's complex supply chains often obscure the true origin and identity of fish products. Fish caught in one region may be shipped to another for processing, then distributed globally with labels indicating the processing location rather than catch site. Multiple species travel under common commercial names, making it impossible for consumers to know exactly what they purchase. This opacity serves industry interests by allowing the substitution of cheaper or more available species for those consumers actually seek. It works against consumer interests by preventing informed choices and enabling fraud. For older adults already managing multiple health considerations, decoding seafood labels and tracing supply chains to ensure they avoid contaminated or unsustainably sourced fish becomes an overwhelming burden. Many simply give up and make choices based on familiarity, actually price, or convenience rather than safety and quality. This resignation means they fail to capture the genuine health benefits available from optimal seafood choices while accepting preventable exposure to contaminants that actively harm their well-being. The cumulative impact of repeated exposure to contaminated fish may not appear for years, making cause and effect relationships nearly impossible for individuals to recognize. A senior woman who eats farmed salmon twice weekly for a decade accumulates a substantial body burden of PCBs and other persistent pollutants. She may develop subtle cognitive changes, slightly elevated inflammation markers, or marginal changes in metabolic function that neither she nor her doctors connect to dietary choices. These subclinical effects degrade quality of life and increase disease risk without producing obvious symptoms that would prompt investigation and intervention. Similarly, a senior man who regularly consumes albacore tuna gradually builds up tissue mercury concentrations. He may notice his hands shake slightly more than before, that finding words becomes harder, or that his balance seems less reliable. Rather than recognizing these as potential signs of neurotoxicity, he and his family attribute them to normal aging. His physician, unaware of his dietary habits and not suspecting mercury poisoning, never orders appropriate testing. The damage continues unchecked until it reaches a point where compensation becomes impossible and decline becomes obvious, even though the underlying cause remains unidentified. These scenarios play out silently among millions of older adults who never realize the fish they eat to promote health actually undermines it. The tragedy lies not in unavoidable harm, but in preventable damage resulting from information gaps and industry practices that prioritize profit over consumer welfare. And with better knowledge and more careful sourcing decisions, these same individuals could genuinely benefit from seafood consumption rather than suffering hidden harm. The solution begins with education, but requires systemic changes to become fully effective. Individual seniors can make better choices armed with accurate information about which species to favor and which to limit or avoid. They can seek out reliable suppliers who transparently document sourcing and handling. They can shift consumption towards smaller fish species with superior safety profiles. These personal actions reduce individual risks substantially, even though they cannot address the broader problems in seafood production and distribution. Professional guidance from healthcare providers could amplify these benefits if doctors routinely discuss seafood choices with older patients as part of preventive care. Simple questions about consumption frequency and preferred species would identify those at elevated risk from mercury or other contaminants. Specific recommendations tailored to individual circumstances would help seniors balance nutritional benefits against contamination risks more effectively. Testing for mercury or other toxins might become appropriate for those with high exposure, allowing detection and intervention before irreversible damage occurs. Yet most healthcare encounters omit any discussion of dietary fish consumption beyond generic encouragement to eat more seafood for heart health. Physicians lack time and often lack knowledge about the significant differences between fish species and sources. The medical system provides no reimbursement for the nutritional counseling that would actually help patients navigate these complexities. This gap between ideal care and actual practice leaves seniors to fend for themselves in a confusing marketplace designed to maximize sales rather than optimize health outcomes. Public health authorities could contribute substantially by issuing clearer, more specific guidance about fish consumption for older adults. Current advisories focus heavily on pregnant women and young children while offering only general suggestions for other populations. The seniors face distinct risks and needs that warrant dedicated recommendations addressing their particular vulnerabilities. Guidance could specify optimal consumption frequencies for various species, identify lowest risk sources, and explain warning signs of excessive mercury or other toxin exposure. Making this information readily accessible and easy to understand would empower better decision-making among older consumers and their caregivers. Regulatory agencies tasked with ensuring food safety could strengthen inspection programs, mandate more comprehensive testing, and enforce stricter limits on contaminants in seafood. The current system samples only a minimal fraction of imported seafood, catches problems after contaminated products have already entered commerce, and imposes penalties too small to deter violations effectively. More rigorous oversight would reduce the contaminated and fraudulently labeled products reaching consumers, making safe choices easier to achieve even without extensive consumer knowledge. The seafood industry itself bears responsibility for the problems created by its production and distribution practices. Pursuing maximum efficiency and profit while externalizing environmental and health costs onto communities and consumers represents a business model that serves shareholders at the expense of broader welfare. Voluntary commitments to improve sustainability and reduce contamination have produced modest progress but fall far short of what mandatory standards could achieve. Without stronger regulatory pressure or dramatic shifts in consumer behavior, industry incentives remain aligned with maintaining current practices rather than transforming them. Environmental advocates working to protect ocean health and sustainable fisheries recognize that human health and ecosystem health intertwine inextricably. The same pollution that contaminates fish and harms human consumers also damages aquatic ecosystems and the species inhabiting them. The overfishing that depletes wild populations and drives expansion of problematic aquaculture also disrupts marine food webs with cascading ecological consequences. Addressing seafood contamination and sustainability requires comprehensive approaches that tackle root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. For individual seniors confronting these challenges at the grocery store or restaurant menu, the complexity can feel paralyzing. They cannot personally reform aquaculture practices, eliminate ocean pollution, or ensure honest labeling throughout commerce. They can only control their immediate purchasing decisions, working with imperfect information in a system structured to obscure rather than reveal the realities of seafood production. Yet these individual choices do matter, both for personal health and as small contributions to market forces that might eventually shift industry behavior. Practical strategies can help older adults navigate these difficulties more successfully. Building a personal list of preferred species and sources creates a framework for consistent decision-making without requiring analysis of every purchase. Favorites might include wild Alaskan salmon, Pacific sardines, Atlantic mackerel, U.S. farmed rainbow trout, and Pacific cod, all chosen for their favorable combination of nutrition, low contamination, and relatively sustainable harvest or farming. Having this reference list transforms grocery shopping from an overwhelming analysis into a simpler sorting task, identifying whether available options match preferred choices. Learning to prepare less familiar species removes barriers to expanding beyond the limited set of fish most Americans consume regularly. Simple recipes that respect the natural flavors of fish without overwhelming them make sardines, mackerel, and herring more appealing to those accustomed to milder options. Trying canned versions first provides an accessible introduction before committing to fresh purchases. Gradually expanding repertoires allows seniors to capture nutritional benefits from diverse species while reducing reliance on problematic options. Reading labels carefully and asking questions of fishmongers or restaurant staff demonstrates consumer interest in sourcing details, even when complete information remains unavailable. The act of asking signals market demand for transparency and may gradually encourage better disclosure. Consistent inquiry from customers creates pressure on retailers to know and share more about their supply chains. Over time, this could shift norms toward greater openness even without regulatory mandates requiring it. Accepting that perfection remains unachievable helps prevent paralysis and abandonment of fish consumption entirely. No food system provides completely risk-free options, and even the best choices involve some trade-offs and uncertainties. Making substantially better decisions most of the time generates meaningful benefits even when occasional suboptimal choices occur. Seniors need not eliminate all fish with any contamination concerns, but rather should shift overall patterns toward lower-risk options while limiting or avoiding the highest-risk species and sources. Connecting with local fishing communities where possible creates opportunities for more direct sourcing relationships with greater transparency and accountability. Coastal seniors may access community-supported fisheries, dockside sales, or other direct purchase arrangements that bypass the obscure supply chains typical of retail seafood. These relationships often provide superior quality along with reliable information about catch methods, handling practices, and species identity. While not accessible to everyone, such options merit exploration where available. Understanding the stakes motivates sustained attention to these issues, despite the effort required. The difference between beneficial and harmful fish consumption affects not just current well-being, but long-term trajectories of aging. Seniors optimizing their seafood choices can expect better maintained cognitive function, reduced inflammation and disease risk, and overall improved quality of life in their later years. Those unknowingly consuming contaminated fish accept preventable decline that diminishes their independence and health prospects. The invisible nature of this harm makes it no less real or consequential than more obvious injuries. Mercury accumulation in brain tissue represents permanent damage that cannot be reversed once it occurs. The neurons killed by methylmercury toxicity do not regenerate, and the cognitive capacities they supported cannot be restored through dietary changes or medical intervention after the fact. This permanence makes prevention through careful fish selection absolutely essential rather than optional. Seniors who've spent decades building cognitive reserve through education, social engagement, and mental activity can see those investments eroded by consuming contaminated fish several times weekly. The methylmercury slowly crosses the blood-brain barrier with each meal, accumulating in brain regions responsible for memory, executive function, and motor control. Over months and years, this accumulation reaches concentrations that trigger cellular death cascades that medicine cannot halt or reverse. The cardiovascular system faces similarly insidious damage from contaminated fish consumption. While omega-3 fatty acids in fish theoretically support heart health, this benefit becomes negated or reversed when the fish carries significant toxin loads. Persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and dioxins interfere with normal vascular function, promoting inflammation in blood vessel walls that accelerates atherosclerosis. These compounds also disrupt lipid metabolism, potentially raising harmful cholesterol fractions despite the presence of beneficial fish oils. Seniors eating contaminated fish in hopes of protecting their hearts may actually increase their cardiovascular disease risk compared to avoiding fish entirely or choosing cleaner alternatives. The selenium paradox in fish consumption deserves particular attention. Selenium is an essential mineral that can protect against mercury toxicity by binding with mercury molecules and reducing their bioavailability. Fish naturally high in selenium relative to their mercury content offer some built-in protection. However, many commonly consumed fish species have unfavorable selenium to mercury ratios, meaning the mercury content overwhelms any protective effect from selenium. Large predatory fish like tuna typically fall into this category, containing enough mercury to cause harm despite selenium presence. Understanding these ratios helps seniors make more informed choices, favoring species where selenium content significantly exceeds mercury levels. Antibiotic residues in farmed fish present a different category of risk that operates on both individual and societal levels. When seniors regularly consume fish containing antibiotic residues, they expose their gut microbiomes to subtherapeutic antibiotic doses that can alter microbial community composition and function. The gut microbiome plays crucial roles in digestion, immune function, vitamin synthesis, and even mental health through the gut-brain axis. Disrupting this delicate ecosystem through chronic low-level antibiotic exposure can contribute to digestive problems, weakened immunity, and increased susceptibility to opportunistic infections. For seniors whose immune systems already face age-related decline, these additional stresses can tip the balance toward illness. Beyond individual harm, antibiotic residues in food contribute to the global crisis of antibiotic resistance. Bacteria exposed to subtherapeutic antibiotic concentrations develop resistance mechanisms that can spread through microbial communities and eventually render life-saving antibiotics ineffective against serious infections. When millions of seniors worldwide consume farmed fish containing antibiotic residues, they collectively participate in selection pressure that breeds resistant bacterial strains. These resistant bacteria can colonize their hosts and spread through communities, eventually causing infections that cannot be treated with standard antibiotics. For elderly individuals who face higher infection risks and often require antibiotic treatment for pneumonia, urinary tract infections, and other conditions, contributing to antibiotic resistance inadvertently undermines their own future treatment options. The accumulation of flame retardants like PBDEs in fatty fish tissue represents yet another concerning exposure pathway. And these industrial chemicals were added to consumer products for decades to reduce fire risk, but turned out to be environmentally persistent and bioaccumulative. They concentrate in fatty tissues of fish, particularly farmed species-fed contaminated fish meal. When consumed, PBDEs disrupt thyroid hormone function, which is especially problematic for seniors since thyroid function naturally declines with age. Thyroid hormones regulate metabolism, temperature control, cognitive function, and energy levels. Additional disruption from dietary PBDE exposure can exacerbate fatigue, cognitive sluggishness, cold intolerance, and metabolic dysfunction that many seniors already experience. These symptoms often get attributed to normal aging when they may actually stem from preventable environmental exposures. Pesticide residues reach fish through agricultural runoff that washes from farmland into waterways where fish live and feed. Both wild and farmed fish can accumulate these chemicals, though exposure patterns differ. Wild fish swimming in rivers and coastal areas downstream from agricultural regions accumulate whatever pesticides happen to be washing into their habitat. Farmed fish accumulate pesticides present in their feed, which typically contains fish meal and fish oil derived from wild-caught fish that may have fed in contaminated waters. Organophosphate and organochlorine pesticides that persist in aquatic environments for years continue accumulating in fish flesh. These pesticides interfere with neurotransmitter function and can contribute to cognitive decline, tremors, and neurological symptoms that overlap with conditions like Parkinson's disease. Distinguishing pesticide-induced symptoms from age-related neurological conditions becomes nearly impossible without detailed exposure history that most doctors don't request and patients can't provide. The concept of total toxic burden helps explain why contaminated fish consumption matters even when individual exposures seem small. Seniors face cumulative exposures from multiple sources throughout their lives: air pollution, drinking water contaminants, household chemicals, food additives, and medications all contribute to total body burden of synthetic chemicals and heavy metals. Adding regular consumption of contaminated fish increases this burden incrementally with each meal. While any single exposure might remain below theoretical safety thresholds, the combination of multiple low-level exposures from various sources can overwhelm the body's detoxification systems. The liver and kidneys that process and eliminate toxins function less efficiently with age. Meaning seniors handle toxic burdens less effectively than younger adults. Reducing exposure from controllable sources like dietary choices becomes increasingly important as detoxification capacity declines. Choosing safer fish alternatives requires understanding which species accumulate fewer contaminants and why. Small fish with short lifespans and positions low on the food chain generally contain lower toxin concentrations. Sardines, anchovies, and herring feed on plankton and live only a few years, giving them little time to accumulate mercury or persistent organic pollutants. These species provide excellent omega-3 fatty acid content without the heavy contamination burden of larger predatory fish. Wild-caught Alaskan salmon offers another good option because salmon populations in Alaskan waters face less industrial pollution than fish from more developed regions. These salmon feed in relatively clean Pacific waters and bioaccumulate fewer contaminants during their shorter lifespans compared to long-lived predators. Atlantic cod, particularly from well-managed northern fisheries, provides another lower-risk option. Cod occupies a middle position in marine food chains, feeding primarily on small fish and crustaceans rather than other large predators. and this intermediate position results in moderate bioaccumulation rather than the extreme concentrations found in apex predators. Cod flesh contains lower fat content than salmon, meaning fewer lipophilic contaminants like PCBs and dioxins accumulate in the edible portions. The white, lean flesh of cod delivers high-quality protein with minimal contamination risk when sourced from cleaner fishing grounds. Trout from well-managed freshwater farms can provide another acceptable choice when wild options aren't available or affordable. Smaller trout farms that use better feed formulations and avoid routine antibiotic use produce fish with lower contaminant levels than industrial operations. These farms typically operate in mountain streams or spring-fed ponds with cleaner water than coastal industrial farming areas. The trout themselves live shorter lifespans and eat lower on the food chain, resulting in reduced bioaccumulation. Seniors seeking farmed fish options should look for transparency about farming practices, antibiotic policies, and feed sources when selecting trout or other farmed species. Reading labels and asking questions about fish origins becomes essential for making informed choices. Country of origin labeling requirements help identify imported fish from regions with less stringent aquaculture standards. Fish imported from Southeast Asian countries often comes from farms with heavy antibiotic use, contaminated water sources, and questionable feed quality. Domestic farmed fish from the United States or Canada typically faces stricter regulatory oversight, though standards still vary considerably between operations. Wild-caught fish should indicate where it was caught, allowing consumers to avoid fish from known polluted areas. Pacific-caught wild salmon from Alaska or sustainable fisheries offers better prospects than Atlantic salmon, which typically comes from industrial farms. Certification labels from organizations like the Marine Stewardship Council or Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program help identify sustainably sourced fish with better quality standards. These programs evaluate fishing and farming practices, environmental impact, and product quality. Fish bearing these certifications generally comes from operations with better oversight and lower contamination risks. While certification doesn't guarantee zero contamination, it indicates attention to quality factors that correlate with cleaner products. Seniors shopping for fish should seek out these labels when available and be willing to pay slightly more for certified products that offer better safety profiles. Preparation methods can reduce contaminant exposure to some degree, though cooking cannot eliminate all toxins. Grilling or broiling fish on racks that allow fat to drip away removes some fat-soluble contaminants that accumulate in fatty tissues. Removing skin and visible fat before cooking eliminates portions of fish flesh with highest contaminant concentrations. However, mercury and some other toxins distribute throughout muscle tissue and cannot be removed through trimming or cooking. So these preparation approaches offer modest risk reduction, but cannot substitute for choosing less contaminated species in the first place. Seniors shouldn't rely on cooking methods to make highly contaminated fish safe. The better approach involves selecting cleaner fish from the start. Frequency and portion size matter significantly for managing contamination exposure. Even relatively clean fish species contain some level of environmental contaminants in today's polluted world. Eating fish daily, even lower contamination species, results in steady accumulation over time. Most experts recommend limiting fish consumption to 2 or 3 servings per week, allowing time for the body to process and eliminate toxins between exposures. Portion sizes around 3 to 4 ounces per serving provide nutritional benefits without excessive contamination exposure. Seniors who love fish and want to eat it frequently should rotate between several different low-contamination species rather than eating the same fish repeatedly, as this distributes exposure across different contamination profiles and reduces risk from any single source. Diversifying protein sources beyond fish altogether offers another protective strategy. While fish provides valuable omega-3 fatty acids and high-quality protein, and these nutrients can be obtained from other sources without the contamination risks. Plant-based omega-3s from flax seeds, chia seeds, and walnuts offer alpha-linolenic acid that the body can partially convert to the longer-chain omega-3s found in fish. Algae-based supplements provide EPA and DHA omega-3s directly without the heavy metal and persistent pollutant baggage that comes with fish. Lean poultry, legumes, and plant-based proteins can fulfill protein requirements without any fish-associated contamination. Seniors concerned about fish contamination can meet all their nutritional needs through careful selection of alternative foods and targeted supplementation when necessary. Testing options exist for individuals who want to know their personal mercury or other toxin levels. Hair mineral analysis can detect elevated mercury from dietary exposure. Diets with hair mercury concentrations reflecting average exposure over several months. Blood tests can measure current mercury levels, though they primarily capture recent exposures rather than total body burden. Urine testing for certain toxins provides another assessment option. Seniors who've eaten contaminated fish regularly for years might consider testing to establish whether they carry significant toxin burdens that warrant medical attention. Chelation therapy can remove some heavy metals from the body when levels reach dangerous concentrations, though this intensive treatment carries its own risks and should only be undertaken under close medical supervision for clearly indicated cases. Healthcare providers often overlook dietary contamination as a contributor to seniors' health complaints. Patients presenting with vague symptoms like fatigue, cognitive difficulties, or neuropathy undergo extensive testing for conventional disease causes, while doctors rarely inquire about fish consumption patterns. Medical education typically doesn't emphasize environmental toxicology or nutritional exposures, leaving most physicians unprepared to recognize contamination-related health problems. Seniors need to advocate for themselves by volunteering information about their fish consumption and specifically asking whether contamination could contribute to their symptoms. Bringing up this possibility plants seeds that might lead to productive investigation of overlooked exposure pathways. The economic dimensions of fish safety create unfortunate disparities in exposure risk. Premium wild-caught fish from clean waters cost significantly more than farmed imports or fish from questionable sources. Seniors on fixed incomes face difficult choices between affordable fish that may carry higher contamination loads and expensive alternatives with better safety profiles. This economic gradient means wealthier seniors can better protect themselves through careful fish selection, while those with limited resources face higher contamination exposure. Public policy should address these disparities through better regulation of all fish products regardless of price point, ensuring that affordable options meet safety standards that protect vulnerable populations. Until such improvements occur, seniors with limited budgets should prioritize eating smaller amounts of safer fish rather than larger portions of contaminated species. Cultural traditions around fish consumption complicate efforts to reduce contamination exposure in some communities. Populations with strong cultural connections to particular fish species or preparation methods may resist changing their dietary patterns even when presented with contamination evidence. Coastal communities, Mediterranean populations, and Asian cultures with fish-centered culinary traditions face particular challenges. Respecting cultural food traditions while promoting safer choices requires sensitive communication and practical alternatives that honor cultural values. Suggesting complete elimination of culturally important foods rarely succeeds and may damage trust in health messaging. More effective approaches acknowledge the importance of these traditions while providing specific guidance about safer species, sourcing, frequency, and portion sizes that reduce risk while maintaining cultural connections. Future improvements in aquaculture practices and fishing regulations offer hope for cleaner fish supplies. Some innovative fish farmers are developing recirculating aquaculture systems that carefully control feed inputs, water quality, and medication use to produce cleaner products. These systems filter and treat water continuously, preventing buildup of contaminants in fish tissues. Organic aquaculture standards that prohibit synthetic chemicals and require careful oversight could become more widespread as consumer demand grows. Stricter international agreements on persistent organic pollutants and mercury emissions from industrial sources would gradually reduce environmental contamination that ends up in seafood. However, these improvements will take years or decades to significantly clean up global fish supplies. Seniors making decisions today cannot wait for future improvements, but must protect themselves with current best practices. Climate change adds additional complexity to seafood safety considerations. Warming ocean temperatures alter fish migration patterns and species distributions, potentially moving fish populations into more or less contaminated waters. Rising ocean acidification and changing marine ecosystems affect the entire food web, with unpredictable consequences for contaminant accumulation patterns. Extreme weather events increase agricultural runoff and industrial pollution entering waterways after storms. And these climate-related changes mean historical data about contamination levels in particular species and regions may become less reliable predictors of current conditions. Ongoing monitoring and adaptive decision-making become increasingly important as environmental conditions shift. Genetic factors influence individual vulnerability to contamination exposure. Some people carry gene variants that affect how efficiently their bodies process and eliminate particular toxins. Huge variations in glutathione production, metallothionein expression, and other detoxification pathways can make individuals more or less susceptible to harm from identical exposures. Seniors cannot easily determine their personal genetic susceptibility to contamination without specialized testing. So the prudent approach assumes higher vulnerability and acts accordingly through careful dietary choices. Those with known genetic conditions affecting detoxification or metabolic function should be particularly cautious about contaminated fish consumption. The long latency period between exposure and obvious health effects means many seniors won't notice contamination impacts until substantial damage has occurred. Mercury neurotoxicity develops gradually over years of accumulation before producing recognizable symptoms. Cardiovascular damage from persistent pollutants similarly unfolds slowly. By the time health problems become apparent, they may be irreversible or difficult to treat effectively. This delayed harm makes contaminated fish consumption particularly insidious compared to hazards with immediate consequences. Prevention through informed food choices offers the only realistic protection since addressing problems after they develop provides limited benefits. Seafood sustainability and contamination often intersect in ways that complicate consumer decisions. So, some of the most environmentally sustainable fishing practices target small schooling fish like sardines and anchovies that happen to also carry lower contamination burdens. Other sustainable fisheries focus on species from pristine environments with minimal pollution exposure. However, sustainability and safety don't always align perfectly. Some farmed fish operations with good environmental practices might still use feeds containing accumulated contaminants. Conversely, wild fish from well-managed fisheries might swim in polluted waters. Seniors ideally seek fish that meets both sustainability and safety criteria, but when forced to choose, personal health protection should take priority since individual dietary decisions have minimal impact on global fisheries while directly affecting personal well-being. Building awareness about fish contamination challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about fish as universally healthy food. Decades of public health messaging encouraged fish consumption for heart health and brain function. Many seniors grew up hearing that fish provides ideal protein and essential nutrients. Recognizing that not all fish delivers these benefits and some species cause net harm requires updating long-held beliefs. This cognitive shift can feel uncomfortable or create distrust in nutritional guidance generally. However, the evolving scientific understanding of fish contamination reflects genuine learning rather than inconsistency. As environmental conditions change and research methods improve, recommendations rightfully adapt to new evidence. The fish contamination issue demonstrates broader environmental health challenges facing aging populations. Industrial chemicals, heavy metals, and other pollutants created for legitimate purposes produce unintended health consequences that become apparent only after widespread exposure. Seniors today bear body burdens of chemicals that didn't exist when they were born. Each generation faces novel exposure challenges from newly created substances whose health effects remain uncertain until decades of human exposure reveal problems. This pattern will likely continue, in requiring ongoing vigilance about environmental health threats and willingness to adjust behaviors as new evidence emerges. Taking action to reduce fish contamination exposure empowers seniors to protect their health through concrete choices. After learning about contamination risks, some people feel overwhelmed or fatalistic, assuming nothing can meaningfully reduce their exposure. Others fall into denial, preferring to ignore uncomfortable information about favorite foods. And neither response serves health interests well. The more constructive approach involves acknowledging real risks while recognizing that informed choices substantially reduce exposure. Replacing high-contamination fish like large tuna with lower-risk alternatives like wild salmon or sardines demonstrably reduces methylmercury intake. Avoiding imported farmed fish from countries with poor aquaculture standards reduces antibiotic residue exposure. These practical steps make real differences in toxin accumulation over time. Sharing information about fish contamination with family and community members extends protection beyond individual benefit. Seniors often prepare meals for spouses, host family gatherings, and influence food choices within their social circles. By applying safer fish selection principles to all meals they control and discussing these issues with others, they help protect people they care about. Particularly important is sharing this information with other seniors who may not have encountered it elsewhere, as older adults face heightened vulnerability while often lacking access to current health information through digital channels. The fish contamination issue ultimately reflects the need for greater environmental stewardship and regulatory protection. Individual dietary choices offer personal protection, but don't address root causes of contamination. Industrial mercury emissions, agricultural pesticide use, inadequate aquaculture oversight, and other policy failures create the contamination that ends up in fish flesh. Meaningful long-term solutions require political action to strengthen environmental regulations, invest in pollution cleanup, and enforce stricter safety standards for both wild and farmed fish. Seniors have valuable roles as voters, activists, and community voices pushing for better environmental health protections that would benefit current and future generations. Looking ahead, seniors who take fish contamination seriously protect not only their immediate health, but also their prospects for maintaining independence and quality of life in later years. But the difference between gradual neurological decline from mercury accumulation and preserved cognitive function could determine whether someone can continue living independently or requires assisted care. The difference between cardiovascular disease worsened by dietary pollutants and a healthier heart could mean more active years with family. These stakes justify the minor inconveniences of being more selective about fish purchases and willing to pay more for safer options. So after understanding the full scope of fish contamination issues, the path forward becomes clear. Seniors should dramatically reduce or eliminate consumption of large predatory fish like tuna, swordfish, and shark that accumulate the highest mercury concentrations. They should avoid farmed salmon, tilapia, and other imported farmed fish from regions with poor aquaculture standards and heavy antibiotic use. Instead, they should choose wild-caught Alaskan salmon, sardines, anchovies, herring, and domestic fish from cleaner waters. They should limit total fish consumption to 2 or 3 moderate servings per week rather than daily intake. They should diversify protein sources and consider algae-based omega-3 supplements as alternatives to contaminated fish. These straightforward guidelines provide actionable protection against preventable harm. The message bears repeating because the stakes are high and the risks remain poorly understood by many seniors. Contaminated fish consumption causes real, measurable harm to brain function, cardiovascular health, and overall well-being in older adults. This harm is preventable through informed dietary choices. The cleaner fish alternatives still provide valuable nutrition without the toxic burden. Making these changes requires some adjustment, but nothing seniors cannot readily accomplish. The benefits of avoiding contaminated fish and choosing safer alternatives compound over months and years, preserving health and function that would otherwise deteriorate. This isn't about perfect purity in an imperfect world, but rather about reducing unnecessary exposure to known toxins with documented adverse effects. That goal is both reasonable and achievable for seniors willing to apply current knowledge to their food choices.